They fooled everyone for a while. But the truth doesn't stay buried, it waits. There is something deeply unsettling about watching someone wear a perfect mask. At first, it's convincing, flawless even. They appear confident, composed, admired. People trust them, defend them, even admire their strength. And if you were the one who saw behind that mask, you know how disorienting it felt. Because what you experienced in private did not match what the world saw in public. That's the power of a carefully constructed persona. It isn't just deception, it's performance. Every word, every reaction, every gesture is calculated to maintain control over how others perceive them. They study people, learn what earns approval, and reflect it back like a mirror. To outsiders, they seem almost too perfect. But perfection is never natural, it is maintained. And anything that must be constantly maintained is already under strain. The mask exists for one reason: to hide what cannot be accepted. Not by others, but by the person themselves. There are parts of their personality they refuse to confront, insecurities they won't acknowledge, emotions they suppress. Instead of integrating these aspects, they bury them, and then they build a version of themselves that appears untouched by weakness. But what is buried does not disappear. It becomes pressure beneath the surface. This is where the illusion begins to crack, not suddenly, but subtly. Small inconsistencies appear. Stories don't align perfectly. Reactions become slightly exaggerated or misplaced. There are moments when the mask slips, just for a second, revealing something colder, something harsher, something real. Most people ignore these moments because the illusion is more comfortable than the truth. But those who have been close enough, those who have been hurt, recognize these cracks immediately. Maintaining a false identity requires constant energy. Every interaction becomes a performance to protect the image. Every criticism feels like a threat. Every loss of control creates panic, because if the mask breaks, everything underneath is exposed, and what lies beneath is exactly what they have spent their entire life avoiding. Over time, the strain becomes too great. The gap between who they pretend to be and who they actually are widens. And the wider that gap becomes, the more unstable their reality gets. They begin to lose track of their own narrative. The lies they told to protect themselves start to conflict with each other. They may even begin to believe their own illusion, which only deepens the eventual collapse. And when pressure builds long enough, something inevitable happens. The truth forces its way out. It doesn't always come in a dramatic moment. Sometimes it's a slow unraveling, a pattern of behavior that becomes impossible to ignore. Other times, it's a single event that exposes everything at once. But in every case, the mask cannot withstand the weight of what it is hiding. It fractures under the pressure of reality. What makes this collapse so powerful is that it doesn't come from the outside. It comes from within. No one needs to destroy the illusion. It destroys itself. The contradictions, the suppressed emotions, the hidden intentions, they all rise to the surface eventually. And when they do, the carefully crafted image begins to disintegrate. The people who once believed in that image start to notice. Doubt replaces admiration. Questions replace certainty. And the person behind the mask is left trying to repair something that was never truly stable to begin with. Because a mask can only survive as long as it is unquestioned. The moment reality begins to challenge it, the cracks spread. And once those cracks appear, they cannot be unseen. You can hide your darkness from the world, But you can't hide it from yourself. There is a part of every human being that remains unseen, unspoken, and often denied. It is not the version we present to others, nor the one we consciously identify with. It is deeper, quieter, and far more powerful than most are willing to admit. This hidden side carries everything we reject about ourselves, our anger, envy, fear, insecurity, and even desires that don't fit the image we want to maintain. Many spend their lives pretending this part doesn't exist. But denial does not erase it. It only drives it further into the depths, where it begins to grow. The more someone tries to suppress this inner darkness, the more influence it gains. What is not acknowledged does not remain still. It becomes active in indirect ways. It seeps into behavior, shapes reactions, and distorts perception. A person may believe they are in control, yet find themselves overreacting, manipulating, or projecting their own flaws onto others without realizing it. They may accuse someone else of dishonesty while living in deception themselves. They may condemn traits in others that exist quietly within them. This is how the shadow operates. It reveals itself through contradiction. For someone who builds their identity on control, superiority, or perfection, the shadow becomes especially dangerous. Because the stronger the image they try to uphold, the more forcefully the hidden parts push back. Every ignored flaw becomes a silent pressure. Every denied truth becomes a weight on the psyche. And over time, that weight begins to demand expression. It often starts subtly, a sharp tone in a conversation, a moment of unexpected cruelty, a reaction that seems disproportionate to the situation. These are not random behaviors, they are glimpses of what has been buried. Most people dismiss them as stress or mood, but they are signals, small cracks where the hidden self begins to surface. As the pressure builds, these moments become more frequent, more intense, and harder to control. The person may begin to feel restless, irritable, or even paranoid. They may sense that something is wrong, but struggle to identify it. Instead of turning inward, they often look outward for explanations. They blame others, create conflict, or try to reassert control in increasingly aggressive ways. This only feeds the shadow further, strengthening the very forces they are trying to escape. What makes this process so powerful is that it is entirely internal. No external enemy is required. The conflict exists within the individual, the divide between who they believe they are and what they have refused to face. And this internal conflict does not fade with time. It intensifies. The shadow is not passive, it is persistent. It watches, waits, and gathers strength in silence. It does not need attention to exist, it only needs neglect. And the longer it is ignored, the more overwhelming it becomes when it finally emerges. When it does surface, it rarely does so gently. It can appear as self-sabotage, destructive decisions, emotional outbursts, or the sudden collapse of carefully maintained relationships. The person may feel as though they are losing control, not realizing that this loss of control is the result of long-term avoidance. Everything they refuse to confront begins to confront them. In this state, the mind becomes divided. One part tries to maintain the image, while the other forces the truth forward. This creates tension that cannot be sustained indefinitely. Eventually, the hidden aspects become too strong to suppress, and they begin to define behavior more openly. Others start to notice the shift. The inconsistency, the instability, the contradiction between words and actions becomes visible. What was once hidden starts to take form in reality, And the person who believed they could outrun their inner darkness begins to realize that it has been with them all along, shaping every step, influencing every choice, waiting for the moment when it could no longer be contained. They rose by deception, but every false throne is already falling. There is a certain kind of power that looks impressive from a distance. It commands attention, demands respect, and often appears untouchable. People gather around it, influenced by confidence, authority, and carefully crafted narratives. But not all power is built on truth. Some of it is constructed on manipulation, distortion, and strategic illusion, and while it may rise quickly, it carries within it the seeds of its own collapse. Power built on lies requires constant reinforcement. It is not self-sustaining, unlike genuine strength, which is rooted in reality and can withstand pressure. False power depends entirely on maintaining belief. The moment people begin to question it, the structure weakens. That is why those who build themselves through deception become obsessed with control. They must manage perceptions, silence doubt, and eliminate anything that threatens the image they have created. This creates a fragile foundation. Every lie must be supported by another lie. Every contradiction must be covered. Over time, the structure becomes more complex and more unstable. It is no longer just about maintaining power. It becomes about surviving exposure. And survival, in this sense, is exhausting. At the core of this dynamic is a deep disconnect from reality. The person begins to believe in their own constructed identity. They repeat their version of the truth so often that it starts to feel real. But reality does not adjust itself to match illusion. It remains constant, waiting for the moment when the illusion can no longer be sustained. The collapse does not happen randomly. It follows a pattern. First, there are small fractures, inconsistencies that don't fully align, moments where the narrative feels forced or unnatural. These cracks are often ignored by those who are invested in the image because acknowledging them would require reevaluating everything they believed. But the cracks remain and they spread. Then comes pressure. External circumstances begin to challenge the illusion. Questions are asked. Doubts are raised. Situations arise that cannot be controlled or manipulated as easily as before. This is where the strain intensifies. The person at the center of it all may respond by tightening their grip, becoming more controlling, more defensive, more reactive. But this only accelerates the process. The more force applied to maintain a false structure, the more visible its instability becomes. Eventually, the weight becomes too much. The lies begin to conflict with each other. The image starts to lose coherence. People who once believed without question begin to notice discrepancies. Trust erodes not all at once, but gradually. And once trust begins to dissolve, it rarely returns to its original form. What makes this collapse inevitable is not external opposition, it is internal contradiction. A system built on falsehood cannot remain consistent because it is not grounded in truth. It must constantly adapt, shift, and reshape itself to avoid exposure. But each adjustment creates new weaknesses. Each attempt to fix one flaw reveals another. As the structure weakens, the effort required to maintain it becomes overwhelming. The person may become increasingly erratic, trying to preserve control over something that is already slipping away. They may blame others, deny evidence, or double down on the very behaviors that caused the instability in the first place. But none of these actions address the root issue. They only delay what is already in motion. When the collapse finally becomes visible, it often appears sudden to those who were not paying close attention. But in reality, it has been building for a long time. Every lie, every manipulation, every avoided truth contributed to this moment. It is not an accident, it is a consequence. And what remains after the fall is not just the loss of power, but the exposure of what that power was built upon. The illusion fades, and in its place stands the reality that was always there, waiting beneath the surface, shaping everything from the very beginning. You didn't lose when you stayed quiet, you were gathering strength. In a world that often equates loudness with power, silence is misunderstood. People assume that if you didn't react, didn't argue, didn't defend yourself publicly, then you must have been weak. They mistake restraint for fear, composure for defeat. But silence, when chosen consciously, is not an absence of strength, it is a form of control that many never learn to master. When you were wronged, there was pressure to respond, to explain your side, to expose the truth, to match intensity with intensity. That pressure doesn't just come from others, it comes from within. The instinct to defend yourself is natural. It rises quickly, fueled by emotion, by injustice, by the need to be understood. And yet, you chose not to act on that impulse, not because you had nothing to say, but because you understood something deeper. Not every battle deserves your voice. Silence in that moment was not surrender. It was observation. While others reacted emotionally, you stepped back. You watched patterns instead of getting lost in them. You allowed people to reveal themselves without interference. Because when someone is driven by ego or manipulation, they rely on reaction. They need opposition to sustain their narrative. They need engagement to keep the dynamic alive. Without it, something shifts. The performance loses momentum. The mask begins to slip without resistance. Choosing silence requires discipline. It means holding back words even when they are justified. It means tolerating misunderstanding, sometimes even judgment, without immediately correcting it. That is not easy. It demands emotional control, patience, and a level of self-trust that most people have not developed. Because in silence, there is no immediate validation. There is no applause, no reassurance, no visible victory. But something else happens instead. Clarity begins to form. When you are not constantly reacting, you start to see things as they are, not as they are presented. You notice inconsistencies. You recognize intentions. You begin to understand the structure of the situation rather than just the surface conflict. And this understanding becomes a kind of power, quiet, steady, and deeply rooted. At the same time, your silence forces others to confront themselves. Without your reaction to deflect onto, they are left alone with their own behavior. Their words echo without interruption. Their actions stand without defense or opposition. And over time, this exposure becomes more revealing than any argument could have been. People begin to notice. Not because you said anything, but because the contrast becomes impossible to ignore. One side grows louder, more reactive, more unstable. The other remains grounded, composed, and consistent. And in that contrast, perception shifts. Silence also protects something essential, your energy. Engaging in constant conflict drains focus, distorts judgment, and pulls you into cycles that lead nowhere. By stepping back, you preserve that energy, you redirected it inward, toward growth, awareness, and rebuilding a sense of self that is no longer dependent on external validation or approval. This is where silence transforms from restraint into strength, because you are no longer reacting out of emotion. You are responding, if at all, from awareness. And sometimes the strongest response is none at all, not because nothing happened, but because you are no longer defined by it. There is a difference between being silent out of fear and being silent out of understanding. Based silence avoids confrontation because it feels incapable. Conscious silence chooses distance because it sees no value in engagement. One comes from weakness, the other comes from clarity. And clarity changes everything. It allows you to move forward without carrying unnecessary conflict. It allows you to see people without illusion. It allows you to detach without resentment, because you understand that not every situation needs to be corrected, some only need to be recognized. In that space, silence becomes more than just the absence of words. It becomes a statement in itself, a decision not to participate in distortion, a refusal to be pulled into dynamics that thrive on chaos, a quiet assertion of self-control in a world that constantly demands reaction. This isn't revenge, it's something far deeper. Their own mind is turning against them. Most people imagine karma as something external, a force that watches, judges, and eventually delivers consequences like a delayed form of justice. They picture it as fate stepping in, balancing the scales, making things right. But the deeper reality is far more complex and far more unsettling. Karma is not something that happens to a person. It is something that unfolds within them. Every action, every lie, every manipulation leaves a psychological imprint. It doesn't disappear once the moment passes. It settles into the mind, shaping how a person thinks, reacts, and perceives the world. When someone consistently chooses deception over truth, control over honesty, or ego over self-awareness, they are not just affecting others, they are conditioning their own inner reality. At first, this isn't obvious. On the surface, they may appear successful, unaffected, even confident. They might move forward without visible consequences, reinforcing the illusion that they have escaped accountability. But internally, something begins to shift. The mind starts adapting to the patterns it repeatedly engages in. A person who lies frequently begins to expect dishonesty from others. Trust becomes difficult because they project their own behavior outward. They become suspicious, guarded, and increasingly defensive, not because others have necessarily betrayed them, but because they understand, on some level, what they themselves are capable of. This is how psychological karma begins to take shape. The inner world becomes unstable. There is a constant need to remember what was said, to maintain consistency between different versions of the truth. This creates mental strain. Over time, it leads to confusion, anxiety, and a subtle sense of fragmentation. The person may feel like they are losing clarity, but they cannot easily identify why. The more they try to maintain control, the more pressure builds beneath the surface. Emotional consequences follow. Guilt, even when suppressed, does not vanish. It transforms. It may appear as irritability, sudden anger, or unexplained tension. It can manifest as restlessness, dissatisfaction, or a persistent feeling that something is wrong. Instead of recognizing the source, the person often externalizes it, blaming circumstances, blaming other people, or creating new conflicts to distract from the discomfort within. But the mind does not forget. Every unresolved contradiction remains active beneath awareness. Every avoided truth creates a split between what is real and what is presented, and maintaining that split requires energy. Over time, it becomes exhausting, This is where the deeper consequence emerges: self-erosion. The person begins to lose connection with their authentic self. They may not even remember who they were before the patterns began. Their identity becomes tied to the roles they play, the image they maintain, and the control they exert over others. Without these, there is a sense of emptiness, an absence of something real and stable. To avoid facing that emptiness, they double down on the behavior that created it. More control, more manipulation, more attempts to dominate perception. But each repetition strengthens the cycle. The more they try to escape the consequences, the more deeply they become embedded in them. This is not punishment in the traditional sense. There is no external force imposing it. It is a natural outcome of internal imbalance. The mind seeks coherence. It seeks alignment between thought, action, and identity. When that alignment is repeatedly disrupted, the system destabilizes, and that instability becomes the consequence. Over time, it can lead to paranoia, where the person feels constantly threatened or exposed. It can lead to isolation, as trust deteriorates on both sides. It can lead to impulsive decisions, emotional volatility, and a loss of control that contrasts sharply with the image they try to maintain. From the outside, it may look like things are falling apart. But what is really happening is that the internal structure was never stable to begin with. The external breakdown is simply a reflection of what has been developing internally all along. Karma, in this sense, is not about justice being delivered. It is about truth asserting itself within the psyche. It is the mind confronting the patterns it has created, the contradictions it has maintained, and the reality it has tried to avoid